All right, today we are going to talk about or start our second unit, which is all about tracking the macroeconomy. So this is unit 2, tracking the macro economy. And in unit 2, we're going to talk about statistics. And the most important statistic that we're going to talk about for the whole semester is GDP. We're going to put it number 1. And we're going to say, what is GDP? So GDP stands for gross domestic product. And let's put here gross domestic product. And by definition, gross domestic product is the dollar value of all final goods and services that are produced inside a country's borders say inside a country within a specific time. Specific time. So that definition, I know, is long, but it gives us a lot of information about what the GDP statistic is all about. And it's important for us to know that GDP is measured in dollars. So you'd be given GDP in a dollar value, like the current GDP of the United States could be $17 trillion. And that means that there are $17 trillion worth of final goods that were produced inside the United States within a certain time frame, maybe within 2017. So in AP Econ, it's important for us to know what would or what would not be included in the GDP. So we're going to create two lists. We're going to say what is counted in GDP, and then our second list is what is not counted in GDP. What is not counted in GDP. And it's going to be important that we can understand or identify what transactions or things that are produced would or would not be counted in the GDP. So let's start with what is counted. Okay. First, goods have to be new. We'll say new and final goods and services. They have to be new and final goods to be counted. Another requirement is they have to be produced within a specific amount of time or within a specific time frame. So let's say goods produced within time frame. For example, if we're measuring the 2017 GDP, we're only counting things that were produced within 2017, nothing before or nothing after. Another thing that would make it so a good would be counted in the GDP is it has to be produced inside a specific country. So if we're counting the U.S. GDP, it has to be produced inside the U.S. So we'll say goods must be produced inside the U.S. And it's important for us to know that they can be exported. So we'll put in parentheses here, can be exported. They don't need to be purchased in the U.S. They just have to be produced in the U.S. to be counted in the GDP. And then the last thing here we'll say is all forms of income are counted. All forms of income are going to be counted. And the idea is that when someone earns income, they're earning income for a good or a service that they produced. And so since we count all goods and services, then we should also count all income that is earned from those goods and services that are produced. So all forms of income also get counted. Now our next list is going to be things that we don't count in the GDP. And so that would be all used goods. It would also be goods that are produced outside the U.S. So we'll say goods produced outside U.S., and those would be imports. So imports are not going to be counted in the GDP. And the next thing that's not counted would be intermediate goods. And intermediate goods are just goods that are used to produce final goods. So a final good would be like a car, an intermediate good would be, the tires or the seats or, all the components that go into making a car. And we don't want to count intermediate goods because if we counted intermediate goods and final goods, then we would be actually counting those intermediate goods twice. And that would make our statistic not accurate. So we don't count intermediate, we only count the value of final goods. And then our last transaction that is not counted is going to be what we call transfer payments. And transfer payments can come in two different forms. They can be from the government. So a government transfer payment would be like a Social Security check. And when someone receives a Social Security check, they're receiving money, but nothing has been produced. And so we don't want to count that in the GDP. We only count transactions where something was produced or a good or service was provided. Okay? And then the last type of transfer payment would be when we purchase financial assets. So we'll say purchase, and usually when we talk about financial assets, we're actually talking about stocks and bonds. So purchase stocks and bonds. And those don't come from the government, but they're transactions that individuals can make, but because nothing was produced or provided, again, then we don't want them to be counted in the GDP. Okay? And so that's kind of our definition of what GDP is. It's the most important economic statistic, but also along with that, now we know what is and what is not counted in the GDP, and we can use that those checklists to help us figure out what transactions we would or wouldn't count. Okay?